Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Gimmel, Parshas Shelach, Sicha Beis, and the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learned the pasuk of Va'anoshim asher sholach Moshe losor es haaretz, and the men that Moshe sent to spy on the land, Vayashuvu Vayalinu olav es kol ha'eda, and they returned and they instigated the whole congregation against Moshe, Lahetzi diba al haaretz, by bringing forth diba on the land. So we learn this pasuk and the Rashi on it. And there are 4 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask 7 questions on Rashi. Number 2, present the key of what is really bothering Rashi. Because once we understand what's really bothering Rashi, then we'll understand everything that Rashi says. Number 3, based on this, answer the 7 questions on Rashi. And number 4, present the Hira and Avodas Hashem. We'll begin with some background to the psukim here that we're discussing. So before these psukim, the Torah tells us about the Chet HaMeraglim and how, as a result, Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu Akenu Badever that he wanted to wipe out all of the Yidden, Chas v'Sholom, and build a new nation for Moshe Rabbeinu, and how Moshe Rabbeinu davened to Hashem, and Hashem accepted his tefillah and said that he won't kill the Yidden. However, he won't allow that generation to enter the land, anyone above the age of 20, but rather they would stay in the Midbar, so that they would all die at the age of 60. So they remained in the Midbar for 40 years, and only afterwards he would bring the next generation into Eretz Yisrael. And in continuation to this, we have our pasuk and the next pasuk with the Rashi on this pasuk. So on Rashi's explanation on the pasuk, Va'anoshim asher sholach Moshe losor es haaretz, and the men that Moshe sent to spy the land, Vayashuvu Vayalinu olav es kol ha'eda, and they returned and instigated the whole congregation against Moshe, Lahetzi diba al haaretz, by bringing forth diba, which we'll see what that means, about the land. So Rashi quotes the words Vayashuvu Vayalinu olav, and they returned and they instigated against him. And he explains, Uchesheshavu mitor haaretz, and when they returned from spying the land, hirimu olav es kol ha'eda, they instigated the whole congregation against him, against Moshe. Ba'itzaz diba, by bringing forth diba about the land. So oisam anoshim vayamusu, those people vayamusu, they died. So Rashi's leading into the next pasuk that starts by saying Vayamusu ha'anoshim, that these anoshim, which were moitziei dibas ha'aretz ra, that brought forth diba ra, bad diba about the land, they died b'magefa, in a plague, lifnei Hashem, before Hashem. So that's the explanation of Rashi on this pasuk, and we'll see there's more to the Rashi, which we'll get to after first explaining this part of the Rashi and asking 4 questions on it. Now, Mefarshim explain that Rashi is coming to teach over here with his explanation that we shouldn't learn Vayashuvu to mean that the Meraglim brought the Yidden to complain again against Moshe. We shouldn't read this pasuk that is telling us a new event that occurred. And it's telling us, Va'anoshim asher sholach Moshe losor es haaretz, and the men that Moshe Rabbeinu sent to spy the land, Vayashuvu, again they returned, Vayalinu olav es kol ha'eda. They made the entire congregation complain against Moshe once again. Rashi is telling us that that's incorrect, but rather, what is this pasuk saying? It's repeating what happened as a lead up to the next pasuk that says Vayamusu. It's telling us Va'anoshim asher sholach Moshe losor es haaretz. It wants to say Vayamusu, they died, but it's just mentioning, so to speak, as a lead up and telling us about these people, what they did. Vayashuvu, that when they returned, Rashi says, Uchesheshavu, and when they returned and they instigated the whole congregation against Moshe by bringing forth diba on the land. So those people, they died. And what's the proof that it's just telling us about what they did and not something new, a new event that occurred, that they once again returned and made the Yidden complain? So the proof is, because if it was saying that they brought the Yidden to complain again, then it should have started with saying Vayashuvu anoshim. It should start Vayashuvu anoshim. We're talking about what they did. They returned and again instigated the people. And since it starts with Viha anoshim, so it means it's telling us something about the anoshim. And what is it telling us? That's telling us what the next pasuk starts with, which is Vayamusa, they died. So it's telling us Va'anoshim, and regarding the people, Asher Shalach Moshe Lasaros Haaretz, that Moshe sent to spy the land, and then when they returned and they instigated the whole nation against Moshe by speaking Diba about the land, so those people died. So it's telling us something about the Anoshim and not something that they did. And there are 4 questions here. The first question is that this whole pasuk is extra according to this explanation. If we learn that the pasuk over here is telling us a new event that occurred, Vayashuvu, Vayalinu Olav, they again returned and instigated the people against Moshe Rabbeinu, so it's not extra. It's telling us about a new event. But if it's not telling us a new event, then the whole thing is extra. And to say that it's an introduction to the next pasuk to tell us Vayamusu Anoshim, Moitziei Dibas Haaretz Ra, that the people that spoke badly about the land, they died by Magefa in a plague Lifnei Hashem, before Hashem. And this is an introduction to tell us Va'anoshim, about these people that Moshe sent to spy the land, and then when they returned, they instigated everyone against him. That's completely extra, because we know all of this already. All of this is already known. So this entire pasuk seems to be extra. The second question is, according to this explanation, Rashi should have just quoted the word Vayashuvu, because that's what he's explaining. He's explaining what's Vayashuvu. It's not telling us something new that happened, but rather Uchesheshavu. It's when they returned. It's just repeating and telling us what they did before. It's the same event as before. So then all that Rashi should quote from the pasuk is the word Vayashuvu. The third question is, what is Rashi teaching us with the words Hirimu olav eskola eda baitzaz diba? That's already written in the pasuk. All Rashi needs to write over here is Vayashuvu, and they returned, and explain to us it doesn't mean something new that happened, but rather Uchesheshavu mitorah aretz. And when they returned from spying the land, that's the meaning of the pasuk here. It's talking about what they did already. And then the rest of the Rashi, that's what the pasuk says. Vayalinu olav, they caused everybody to complain. They instigated everyone. So why does Rashi add over here the words Hirimu olav eskola eda baitzaz diba? That they instigated the whole nation against Moshe by saying Diba. That's exactly what the pasuk says. And the fourth question is, what is Rashi adding with the end? Oisam anoshim vayamusu. Rashi is coming here to tell us that Vayashuvu means Kishashavu. So what's he adding at the end? Oisam anoshim vayamusu. And you can't say it's to negate Kol Ha'eda, because it says in the pasuk Vayashuvu Vayalinu olav as Kol Ha'eda. So maybe Kol Ha'eda was Vayamusu. You can't say that's what Rashi is coming to negate and tell us, no, it's only Oisam Anoshim Vayamusu. Since it says clearly in the next pasuk that says Vayamusu, it says Vayamusu Ha'anoshim Moitziei Dibas Haaretz Ra B'Magefa Lifnei Hashem. It was only those people. And it's also very difficult to say that since this side point is so long, we have this whole side point, Uchesheshavu, and when they returned from spying the land, they instigated the whole congregation against Moshe by speaking about the land. So we have this whole side point. So Rashi comes back and tells us it's those people that died. So we're going to say that since this side point is so long, so it goes back to repeat what it started with, to say it's all an introduction to Vayimusu. It's very difficult to say this because it's self-understood. Obviously, that's what the pasuk is saying. This is not something that Rashi has to therefore recap and say Oisam Anoshim Vayimusu. Rashi continues in the same exact teaching. He continues right after the word Vayamusu, and he says, Kol haitzaz diba, whenever it says bringing forth diba, l'shain chinuch dvarim. It means that a person is training their speech. Shemalkichim l'shainam la'adam l'daber bay. They're training their tongue to a person by talking about him. And he brings an example, K'may doiviv sifse yeshenim, that it's training the lips of those who are slumbering to be able to talk. And then Rashi concludes, V'yeshna l'toiva, v'yeshna l'ra. Sometimes it's for something good, and sometimes it's for something bad. It exists for both of them. When you have the word diba, it is found where it's for good, and it's found where it's for bad. L'kach nemer kan, that's why it says over here, meaning in the next pasuk, Moitzei diba sa'aretz ra'a. It adds the word ra'a because the word diba alone doesn't mean necessarily bad. And he concludes, Sheyesh diba shehi teva, because there is a diba that's good. Because of space, we don't have over here the gray box with the arrow pointing upwards. Instead, we have a gray scroll to explain what Rashi is saying. So simply, the difficulty Rashi is answering is that in the next pasuk it says dibas haaretz ra'a, and then our pasuk it just says lohitzi diba al haaretz. It doesn't say ra. So Rashi answers and tells us the reason is because the word diba itself doesn't mean necessarily that it's something bad, because v'yeshna l'tova, v'yeshna l'ra. And so l'kach and emar in the next pasuk mitziyeh diba sa'aretz ra. Sheyesh diba shehi tova, because there's diba which is tova. So he's answering over here. This is what it seems like. Why in the next pasuk it says diba sa'aretz ra, even though in our pasuk it just says diba. And there are three questions here. The first question is that this teaching of Rashi should be in the next pasuk, because that's where the question arises. When we get to the next pasuk and it says Ra, that's where the question comes up. So that's where this teaching of Rashi should be. The second question is that if for whatever reason you're going to explain that it does belong in our pasuk, but simply there's no connection between what Rashi explains over here about Diba to what he explains at the beginning about Ucheshashavu. And so if that's the case, Rashi should have taught it in a separate Dibra Maschel. He should have quoted from the pasuk the word Diba and then explained Kol Eitzos Diba v'chulu. Why is it all in one teaching of Rashi, in one Dibber? And the third question is, why does Rashi repeat at the end Sheyesh Diba Shehi Tova? He already said earlier V'yeshna l'tova, v'yeshna l'ra. So why does he say again at the very end, sheyesh diba, shehi tova? Now we're going to move on to the key of the Sicha. And the key of the Sicha is to understand what's really bothering Rashi. And once we understand what's really bothering Rashi, then we'll see how everything that Rashi says comes to answer those questions, and how everything that Rashi says fits perfectly with answering those questions, and that's why Rashi says what he says. So the explanation of all of this is as follows. In addition to what we said, that Rashi is coming to teach us that this wasn't a second complaint, the main teaching of Rashi here is to answer our first question, which was that the whole pasuk over here seems to be extra. And Rashi is also coming to answer another question in our pasuk. So there's a thing Rashi wants to teach us, that it's not a second complaint. But then there is also two questions that Rashi is coming to answer. The main question is that this whole pasuk seems to be extra, and then there's another question in our pasuk, and that is, in the words of Hashem to Moshe, so over there it emphasizes that the complaint of the Meraglim was against Hashem, and like it says clearly, Ad Moshe la'eda razais asher hema malinim olai gomer, that they're complaining against me, against Hashem. And the same thing is written clearly regarding the complaint of the rest of the Yidden. Over there it says, Im Gomer l'chola eda razais hanayadim olai gomer. Again, it speaks about how they complained against Hashem. And in this pasuk, where it talks about what they did, it speaks about their complaint against Moshe. Now, even though they also complained against Moshe, as it says, Vayiloinu al Moshe val Aaron kol bnei Yisrael gomer. But number one, also Aaron is included there. We don't see Moshe being separate from Aaron. And in our pasuk it mentions Moshe specifically. And number two, more importantly, complaining against Hashem is much more severe than complaining against Moshe. So why does the pasuk over here emphasize that they made everyone complain against Moshe and not Hashem? And over here already now we're going to answer our second question. And that is that since Rashi is also answering this third question about why it emphasizes Moshe, therefore he also quotes the words Vayiloinu olav, because that's what he's coming to answer. He's coming to answer, why does it say olav? And in addition, because the point of the answer of Rashi regarding what this whole pasuk is teaching us, as we'll see, we didn't answer that at all. What is this pasuk teaching us? The point of the answer is answered through the words Vayiloinu olav. So that's where Rashi quotes the words Vayiloinu olav. Number one, because he's coming to answer why does it say Vayiloinu olav on Moshe and not on Hashem. And number two, because those words are the key to understanding what this whole pasuk is coming to tell us. Because it seems like the whole pasuk is extra. Those words are the key to understanding what this pasuk is teaching us and why this pasuk is not extra. And so therefore, Rashi quotes these two words as well. Now we're going to move into the main point of the answer and answering questions 1, 3, and 4. So this pasuk is coming to answer a simple question. The question is, in the previous psukim, it's explained how Hashem became angry at the Yidden to the extent that he said, Akenu badever v'rishanu, that Hashem wanted to smite the Yidden with the plague and then build a new nation out of Moshe Rabbeinu. And nevertheless, Moshe, through his tefillah, he was able to bring about that Hashem said, Salachti kidvarecha, that he forgave the Yidden, that they shouldn't die right away, but rather over a span of 40 years, and to the extent that none of them died before the age of 60 years old. And so the question is, if so, why wasn't the tefillah of Moshe also able to help for the Meraglim, that they too should not die right away on that very day? Because in Pshuta Shemikra, they died that very day. And that's why our pasuk comes before the next pasuk that teaches Vayamusu Anoshim. The next pasuk tells us that they died. Our pasuk comes beforehand, and it tells us Va'anoshim asher shalach Moshe v'gomer vayashuvu vayalinu olav v'skala eda gomer. The pasuk is telling us over here, and that's why it's not extra. It's coming to tell us what's the reason Vayamusu Anoshim. What's the reason they died and the tefillah of Moshe was not able to help them? It's because they intended to fight against Moshe himself, and therefore the tefillah of Moshe was not able to help them. And like the rule that Rashi already taught us, that ein kateger nasa saneger, the prosecutor, the reason for the prosecution cannot become the defense. And since the reason for the prosecution was that they complained against Moshe, so that can't become their defense. The tefillah of Moshe can't help them. And also we know the rule that Rashi taught us, that a person is judged midah keneged midah. And since they attacked Moshe, so Moshe can't be used to help them. So that's what this pasuk is coming to teach us. This pasuk is not extra. It's coming to explain to us what's the reason the tefillah of Moshe was able to help for the whole Klal Yisrael, but it wasn't able to help for the Meraglim themselves. The pasuk is telling us the reason is because Va'anoshim asher shalach Moshe, those people, Vayashuvu vayileinu olav, they complained against Moshe. They went against Moshe, and so therefore the tefillah of Moshe cannot help them. And that's exactly what Rashi is telling us over here. That's why we have the whole continuation of Rashi, the section that we asked the question on. We asked questions 3 and 4. Why does Rashi say Hirimu olav eskola eda v'yitzaz diba oisam anoshim vayimusu? That's what Rashi is explaining on the words vayashuvu vayileinu olav. Rashi is telling us that Hirimu olav eskola eda v'yitzaz diba so oisam anoshim vayimusu, because they instigated the whole congregation against Moshe. So those people who did it, they died, because they went against Moshe. So Moshe's tefillah cannot be helpful to them. And that's what Rashi is teaching us over here. Rashi is telling us the meaning of this pasuk is, what's the reason the tefillah of Moshe couldn't help them? Because hirimu olav as kol ha'eda, because they instigated the whole congregation against him by itzaz dibah, with they're bringing forth dibah. And therefore, Aisam Anashim, those people, Vayamusu, they died because the tefillah of Moshe couldn't help them. Now, even though the Yidden also complained against Moshe, like it says, Vayiloinu al Moshe gamer, Kol b'nei Yisrael gamer, but their intent wasn't to go against Moshe. By the Meraglim, they had an intent to go against Moshe, so the tefillah of Moshe couldn't help them. By the Yidden, that wasn't their intent. And they were just concerned about being killed, so they complained against Moshe because their fear of being killed. Whereas the Meraglim, they specifically went against Moshe, and that's why the tefillah of Moshe couldn't help them. And this is what the pasuk is coming to tell us, and this is what Rashi is telling us is the meaning of the pasuk. According to all this, the flow of the two psukim is very well understood, and it's also understood why the second pasuk repeats Moitziye diba sa'aretz ra, even though the first pasuk already says Lo heitzi diba la'aretz. The first pasuk is not talking about what caused the death of the Meraglim, but rather why the tefillah of Moshe wasn't able to help them like it helped the rest of Klal Yisrael. And it only says in that pasuk Lo heitzi diba la'aretz because that's what happened. It's not telling us the reason the tefillah of Moshe didn't help with those words. It's telling us the reason the tefillah of Moshe didn't help is because Vayiloinu olav es kol ha'eda, because they instigated the whole congregation against him. Now, in what was it? It was in Lo heitzi diba la'aretz. So the emphasis over here is not the Lo heitzi diba la'aretz. That's just telling us because that's what happened. The emphasis over here is that it was Vayiloinu olav, that they instigated everyone against Moshe Rabbeinu. And the second pasuk tells us what caused their death, and that was that they were moitzi diba sa'aretz ra. They spoke badly against the land, and that was against Hashem. So they died because of what they did against Hashem. And the reason the tefillah of Moshe didn't help is because they instigated everyone against Moshe, and ein kateger nasas haneger, and the way Hashem judges is in a way, like we said, of midah keneged midah. Now we're going to move on to answering questions 5, 6, and 7. Really what we're moving on to answer is, what's the second part of Rashi here for? Why is it included in this Rashi? It seems like we have a full and complete understanding of what the Pasuk is telling us. However, as we'll see, there's actually a difficulty in what we said up to now. There's a question, and that question is what Rashi is coming to answer with his whole explanation about Diba. So, according to all of this, however, we need to understand, since the whole intent of this pasuk is to explain Vayiloinu Olav, that they instigated everyone against Moshe Rabbeinu, and that's why Moshe's tefillah couldn't help them, and it's not here to explain the reason they died, so it would fit better not to mention in the first pasuk the oven that caused them to die. There should be no mention of it over here whatsoever. Even though it's normal for the pasuk to tell us that side detail, but over here where it could confuse someone, that it's telling us something of relevance, it shouldn't be written, because then it seems like it's also teaching the reason they died. So it shouldn't be written here at all. And therefore Rashi adds right away in the same dibur, his teaching that Koloid says Diba l'shein chinuch dvarim chulu v'yeshna l'toiva v'yeshna l'ra. This is what Rashi is coming to answer. That's why it belongs over here, because there's a question that is now here after we learn the first part of Rashi. Why does it say in the pasuk over here that they were moitzi Diba? Why does it mention it? It could confuse us and make us think that that's the reason they died. That's the reason over here in the pasuk, and we're not going to be able to fully and properly focus just on the words Vayiloinu Olav. So that's why Rashi adds right away in the same dibur that Kolait says Dibur l'shein chinuch dvarim chulu v'yeshna l'teva v'yeshna l'ra, meaning that the pasuk is not mentioning any oven, but rather that they complain through speech, because the word Dibur doesn't mean something bad. In other words, the Torah purposely wrote Diba plainly. That can also be L'Teva, because for this pasuk, even if they complained against Moshe with good speech, it would still explain why the tefillah of Moshe wasn't able to help them. Because if they're complaining against Moshe, it makes no difference if it's Tova or Ra. If it's against Moshe, Moshe can't help them. So that's what Rashi tells us, that this pasuk is not saying anything about speaking badly about the land, something against Hashem, because the use of the word Diba does not indicate that it was something bad, because all Diba means is that someone's training their speech. It could be for good, it could be for bad, it could be for anything. It doesn't have to be specifically bad. And Rashi brings a proof for this from the next pasuk, where it says, that's why he says, L'kach nemar, he's not saying therefore we should understand why in the next pasuk it says Ra. He's saying because Diba could be good, what's his proof? From the fact that in the next pasuk, L'kach nemer kan, in the next pasuk, Mitzia Diba Sa'aretz Ra. So when he brings the next pasuk, it's not to explain the next pasuk, he's explaining our pasuk. And the next pasuk is the proof, since in the next pasuk it says Ra, and there it's teaching why they died, why the Meraglim died, and it needs to tell us it was Ra, so that proves that in our pasuk, where it doesn't say Ra, it means that it's not talking about their oven. It's not talking about their bad speech. That's not what's relevant in this pasuk. The only thing relevant in this pasuk is that it was Vayiloinu Olav. And so it's understood that this pasuk is not telling us why they died, but just why the tefillah of Moshe wasn't able to help them. And this is also why Rashi repeats at the end, Sheyesh Diba Shehi Tova. Rashi starts off and tells us, V'yeshna l'tova, v'yeshna l'ra. That's why in the next pasuk it says Ra, because otherwise we don't know what's Ra. And then he concludes, Sheyesh Diba Shehi Tova. He's not just telling us it exists, we know it exists. He said at the beginning, V'yeshna l'tova. Rather, he's telling us Sheyesh Diba Shehi Tova, which is the Diba in our pasuk. He's referring to the first pasuk, to our pasuk, where it doesn't say what type of speech it was. And even if it was positive, even if it was tova, it would be understood why the tefillah of Moshe wasn't able to help them. And this we answer the last three questions. Why is this Rashi in our pasuk? Why is it in the same dibur? And why does he conclude sheyesh diba shehi tova? Because he's explaining to us that the word diba over here in our pasuk is just telling us speech, and it could be tova. In our pasuk they could have spoken a good speech, but since it was against Moshe, therefore the tefillah of Moshe couldn't help them. So that's why it's over here. And that's why it's in the same dibur, and that's why he concludes sheyesh diba sheyitayva, which is the diba in our pasuk. And so that explains to us why these words are not problematic, that they're being inserted in the pasuk that just talks to us about they're complaining against Moshe. Why do you have the word diba that indicates speech about the land? Because diba does not indicate bad speech about the land. Diba just indicates that they used their speech for something. It's irrelevant if it was good or bad. What's relevant is that it was being used against Moshe. And that's the reason why the tefillah of Moshe couldn't help them. The Hira, the lesson in Avodah is, it says in Tikkunei Zoyar that Ispashtus of the Moshe b'chol dara v'dara. There's an Ispashtus of Moshe in every generation. And Razal said, Ein der shein b'kei Moshe. There's no generation that doesn't have in it someone like Moshe. And it's understood that just like Moshe Rabbeinu was mispalel for each and every Yid, and he concerned himself with all the Yidden to the extent that this is how Hashem tested him when he was a shepherd, by seeing if he cared for each and every sheep. So the same is true with Ispashtusa the Moshe b'chol dar, that they concern themselves and are mispalel for each Yid in their generation. And even though there are many that are able to be mispalel on their own, a complete tefillah, and actually everyone has a mitzvah saseh to be mispalel, but nevertheless even they need the tefillah of Moshe of their generation. And the reason is because, like it says in Tanya, that Rosh Alf Yisrael Chulu Heim Chinas Rosh Umayach, they're the level of Rosh Umayach, and therefore it's understood that just like in Gashmias, when something is missing or there's pain in any of the limbs of the body, it's specifically felt in the Rosh Umayach. So the same is true in Ruchnias, that the tefillah for the whole body of Yidden, for all its limbs, is through the Rosh Umayach that feels it fully, the Moshe Shebadar. And furthermore, the tefillah of an individual is elevated through the Moshe Shebadar, since he is the memutza machaber of Yidden and Hashem, and like it's written that Moshe Rabbeinu said, Anochi Eimed ben Hashem u'benechem, that Moshe stands between Hashem and the Yidden, and so even the tefillah of a Yochid is elevated through the Moshe Shebadar. And we learn this from the conduct of Moshe in our Parsha. Yidden went off the straight path to the extent that it was decreed upon them that Akenu Gomer, that Hashem would smite them. And since they were a der deya, meaning they had a connection to the level of Moshe, who's the level of Das, so certainly they were on a high level in their Avodas Hashem, including in Avodas Tefillah. And nevertheless, only Moshe Rabbeinu, through his Tefillah, was able to accomplish that not only shouldn't they die right away, but that they should all live until the age of 60, meaning that many of them lived close to 40 years after the Chet HaMeraglim. And it wasn't a life of pain, but rather a good life, both in Gashmis and in Ruchnis. Like we know in Gashmis, they had the Lechem and the Shemayim, they had Mayim of Be'er of Shemiriam, they had the Anani HaKaveh to protect them from the dangers in the desert, and also to clean and iron their clothing. And also in Ruchnis, they were on a very high level. And similarly regarding the Moshe Shebechol Der, that he concerns himself with each and every Yid, and he is mispalel, and he's effective through his tefillah by drawing down kol tuv begashmis of Ruchnis.